The discussion is the scariest section to write in a scientific report because we have to actually add our own knowledge to it. I'm going to break down how I write a discussion section, including a step-by-step guide on how to write each paragraph with examples. And it all comes down to 5 key points. Number 1 is understanding what the discussion is. If you ask anybody at university, they'll tell you the discussion section is where you explain the implications, the relevance, and the significance of your study, which I always found to be really frustrating because nobody actually explains what that means. But the point is that the discussion follows the results section, which is where we describe our findings bit by bit. So while our results section describes our findings, our discussion section then takes those findings and explains them, and how they answer our aims and research questions, how they compare to other people's research or the current body of knowledge in the literature, and why it's important. And in fact, the discussion is actually the most important section of your entire scientific report because it explains what your study found and why it's important. Now that we understand what the discussion section actually is, we need to better understand our area of research. And the best way to do this is by reading a lot of literature before we start writing. The best way to tackle this I've found is to open up PDFs of journal articles or book chapters relevant to my work on my computer. And then next to that, I have a Word document open. Then as I'm reading, I highlight sentences or entire paragraphs that are important to my work or relevant to my work. Then in the Word document, I'd pop down the citation of that research, for example, Or et al. 2022, and I'd copy and paste in those sentences or entire paragraphs. If I'd highlighted a lot in a particular PDF, rather than copy and pasting all of it over, I'd just put a bullet point summary down for myself. For example, if we did a study on trees in Central Australia, my first bullet point might be, this study explains why there are more trees in wet areas, or this study discusses why there are more native trees in dry areas. I'd keep reading as much literature as I could, highlighting and pasting them into my Word document as I went, until I had a Word document that was full of information that was relevant to my study. This helped me in 2 different ways. First of all, before I started doing this method, I'd be writing my discussion section and I'd come to write a point and realize, I've read something about that before, and then I could never remember where I read it, and I'd waste so much of my time rereading the literature I'd already read. Having this Word document stopped me from having to do that. I could just Command F and find that point and who wrote that research. So I'd have my citation as well. And the second way it helped me was as I was writing each of my individual paragraphs in my discussion section, I already had the information that I needed to make my research relevant and compare it to other studies and the current body of knowledge. Once I finished reviewing the literature, I then moved on to deciding how my discussion section would flow. The discussion section of a scientific report flows from specific to broad. So the specific components in the beginning are where we interpret or explain our individual findings in detail. Whereas as we move out towards the end of the discussion, we're talking about the implications or importance of our study as a whole. Why does it matter to people? And the best way to do this effectively is by using the correct language. The discussion section should be written in present tense and an active voice. And the easiest way to do that is by combining those 2 together. Present tense is where we use words like is instead of was, and active voice is where we put the emphasis on the doer rather than the process, which is passive voice. For example, in this study, we used tree height to XYZ instead of, in this study, tree height was used to XYZ. In the first example, the emphasis is on the doer, we use, that's us, and it's in present tense, we use the word use. Whereas in the second example, it's in passive voice, the emphasis is on the process, tree height was used. There's no mention of a doer anywhere in that sentence. And it's also in past tense. It has words like was and used. Recognizing the difference between active voice and passive voice can be tricky. Sometimes you can tell because your sentences are really long, or your main point is at the end of the sentence instead of at the beginning, which is where it should be. But I always recommend changing the grammar settings in your Word document to recognize passive voice. That way it will just highlight it for you and you can edit it later. And remember, never edit your discussion section while you're writing it. Always write a complete draft and then come back and edit it later. Okay, now that we know how to write a discussion section, we need to talk about what to write about. And the key here is structure. The structure of the discussion section will either follow your results section or it will follow the themes and topics of your research questions, which is what I use in my scientific reports. In my research, I figure out what the climate was in the past using rocks. I'm a geologist. And in my results section, I group my data together by type. For example, all my data about what my rocks look like, and then all the data about what my rocks are made of. Whereas in my discussion section, I group it by the themes or topics of my research questions. So I usually have a subheading called climate and another one on environment. That's the structure I use. Which structure you use will depend on the size of your study and on the scientific discipline you're in. For most undergraduate scientific reports, it'll probably follow the themes or topics of your research question, and it may not even have any subheadings. Irrespective of the structure that you choose for your discussion section, the first paragraph of your discussion should always always discuss the overall finding of your study and how it answered the research question. You should also highlight the main results that gave you that answer. Imagine that a reader picked up your scientific report and read your introduction and then your discussion section. They should flow seamlessly into each other and make complete sense to the reader. After that paragraph comes the body paragraphs. This is where we actually explain the individual findings that gave us the answer to our research question. And this section takes the most amount of work. Here is the formula that I use to write my discussion paragraphs. First off, I make a bullet point plan for each paragraph, and I do it for my entire discussion section. Each paragraph has only one point in it, but those points might take multiple types of data or findings in it. And this really helps us identify the difference between data and our findings. For example, the data might be trees range between 3 meters and 28 meters, and rainfall in this area was 400 mils per year, and in this area it was 600 mils per year. Whereas our finding is that trees are taller in wet areas. It separates the two in our minds, and it's important in our discussion that we only write about the key findings that are relevant to our aims and research questions, and that we don't write about every single little data detail. Once I've finished my bullet point plan for my discussion section, I can then start writing because I already know what I'm going to be writing about. The first sentence of the paragraph is the statement sentence, and this is where I convert the bullet point into a sentence. I'm just making it clear and easily understood by the reader. I try to make my statement sentences short, between 10 and 25 words is ideal. I then follow that statement sentence with a detail sentence. And this detail sentence can provide either a concrete example to that statement or supporting data, or just provide extra detail. An example of a statement sentence could be, I went for a run today. The detail sentence that follows that could be, I ran 10 kilometers along a path by the river. So I deliver the statement, and then my detail sentence builds a picture in the reader's mind. And it's in our detail sentence that we identify patterns, relationships, similarities, or differences within our own data. I then follow my detail sentence with a comparison sentence. In the comparison sentence, we compare the main point in our statement sentence to what other researchers have found in their studies. To compare, we can analyze or identify patterns, relationships, similarities, or differences between our data and their data. And there are different ways that we can compare data, and it will depend on your scientific discipline and your specific study. But some common ways of comparing data are the same time but different place. For example, if we were doing a study on what trees were like 100 years ago, but we were looking at that in Central Australia, Melbourne, Sydney, or Northern Territory, or even Africa. We could also do a comparison with studies in the same place but different time. For example, doing a study on trees in Central Australia, we could look at research that was done now compared to 10 years ago, 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. We could also compare our data with research that did the same study or experiment but on different samples. For example, perhaps they did a study on trees, but they measured different types of trees. Perhaps we did eucalyptus and they did pine. We could also compare it with research that did the same samples but different study. For example, when researchers do work on ice cores from Antarctica, they might research oxygen isotopes, hydrogen isotopes, or fossils. So the same sample but a different study. We can also compare our work with research that did the same study on the same samples but with different variables. Surveys are a great example of this. For example, you could have a survey of the same people but where different studies ask them different research questions. In our example, if I was studying changes in tree height in Central Australia, I'd be interested in comparing my study to other research that was done in the same location on trees but at different times. And this is where I found it most helpful to use that running Word document, because I already had all that information in there about other research that was relevant to my own. And this made comparing them easier. Remember, the point of the comparison sentence is to link your research with other research and link them both back to your aims and research questions. After I write my comparison sentence, I write my highlight sentence. This is where I relate the information in my comparison sentence back to the main point in my statement sentence. In each paragraph, once we've made a statement or a comparison, we need to explain how or why. For example, why are our results different from other studies? Or how are our results similar? Or how do our results agree with other research? Because a good discussion will state which studies have similar or different findings to their own, but a great discussion will explain how and why those studies are similar or different. A great way to double check that your paragraph is on point is by reading your statement sentence and then reading your highlight sentence, and ignore all the sentences in between. If those two sentences make sense together on their own, then your paragraph is still on point. If not, you've probably changed course and you just need to change that highlight sentence to fit that paragraph better. Here's an example of a discussion paragraph. Height measurements collected from eucalyptus and acacia trees in the Simpson Desert indicate trees are taller in wet areas. In fact, trees were on average 30% taller in wet areas compared to the same species in dry areas. Smith and Clark 2020 also determined trees were taller in wet areas of the Gibson and Tatami deserts. Wet conditions likely provide enough moisture for the trees to go tall, whereas in dry conditions the trees might restrict their growth and keep their moisture as warm, dry air takes water from their leaves. Johnson 2018. That paragraph has a statement sentence, a detail sentence, a comparison comparison sentence, and a highlight sentence. But it's also important to know that your paragraph isn't limited to 4 sentences. You can have as many detail and comparison sentences as you need to back up that main point in your statement sentence. Once you've finished writing that paragraph, you then move on to your next bullet point, which is your next paragraph. I follow this formula for every single paragraph in my discussion section. Once we're finished discussing all the key findings, we need to write a limitation paragraph. Now, limitations are not errors or mistakes. Limitations are just things that restrict the implications of our study. For example, a small sample size, or a study only done on one specific area or only one specific time period. It's about the overall research design. I find it always best to finish a limitation paragraph with a strong positive sentence. I use it to explain how my study is still relevant and that the research approach I took is valid to answer my aims and research question. You can also link your limitations with future work, but I find that that's best done in a future statement in your conclusion section. Okay, now we want to finish the discussion section on a positive note and definitely not the limitation paragraph. Instead, we do this with the closing paragraph. This is where we highlight the overall finding of our study or your answer to the aims and research questions. This is where you bring it home, identify why it matters. It's also a great place to identify any practical applications or implications of the study, if you're in a practical scientific discipline. Now, with all of these tips, you still need to write a banger conclusion to nail your scientific report and get the best grades possible. Because all of this will really help you write your report, but the more writing tricks you know, the better. So make sure you watch this video next to take what you've learned and add to it the 7 keys to writing a perfect conclusion.